Hello everyone, welcome to our channel University of Political Science. Toda I discusses about Plato the Statesman and the laws. The later form of Plato's political philosophy, contained in Plato the Statesman and the laws, belongs a good many years after that contained in the Republic. The two later works show a resemblance, and the theory which they contain is in marked contrast with that of the Republic. Together they present the final results of Plato's reflection upon the problems of the city-state. The Laws was definitely a work of his old age, and all critics agree in finding in it evidence of declining powers, though this has very often been exaggerated. In respect to literary quality, there is no comparison between the Republic and the Laws. The earlier work is conceded to be the greatest literary masterpiece in the whole range of philosophical writing. The Laws, on the other hand, is distinctly hard reading. It is rambling, even when all allowance is made for the liberties in this regard that the dialogue form permitted. It is wordy, and it is repetitious. The tradition that it lacked the author's final revision is plausible. It contains fine passages which competent scholars consider as fine as any in Plato's works, but he has lost either the capacity for, or the interest in, sustained literary effect. Because of its defects of style, the Laws has been little read, as compared with the Republic, and there has perhaps been a tendency to confuse its decline in literary quality with a decline in intellectual power. This is certainly a mistake. The political philosophy of the Laws has not the bold sweep of speculative construction that is found in the Republic, but on the other hand, in the later form of his theory, Plato tried to come to grips with political actualities in a way that he never approached in the earlier work. This accounts in part for its lack of order. It is developed less upon a single train of thought and more upon the complexities of its subject matter. The Republic is a book for all time, because the generality of its principles is almost timeless. But the later form of Plato's thought was more influential in the development of political philosophy by his successors in the ancient world. This is evident in the case of Aristotle, since it is the Statesman and the Laws, rather than the Republic, which formed the point of departure for the Politics. In respect to its influence on the discussion of specifically political questions in their theoretical aspects, such, for example, as the constitution of states, their political organization, and especially the theory of the so-called mixed state, it would be hard to exaggerate the importance of the Laws. The readmission of law. The line of thought which Plato followed in the Republic yielded a theory in which everything was subordinated to the ideal of the philosopher-king, whose unique claim to authority is the fact that he alone knows what is good for men and states. The working out of this line of reflection resulted in the exclusion of law altogether from the ideal state, and the conception of the state as an educational institution only, in which the majority of the citizens are in a condition of permanent tutelage to the philosopher-ruler. This ran quite contrary to the deepest convictions of the Greeks about the moral value of freedom under the law, and of participation by the citizens in the task of self-government. In this sense, the first form of Plato's political theory was one-sided in its devotion to a single principle and inadequate to express the ideals of the city-state. This suspicion in the mind of its author was responsible for the direction which his later thought took. As the name of the dialogue indicates, the Laws was written in an attempt to restore law to the place which it occupied in the moral estimation of the Greeks and from which Plato had tried to remove it. The fundamental difference between the theory of the Republic and that of the Laws is that the ideal state of the former is a government by specially chosen and specially trained men, quite untrammeled by any general regulations, while the state sketched in the latter is a government in which law is supreme, ruler and subject alike being subject to it. But this difference implied drastic changes in all the underlying principles of government, more drastic changes than Plato succeeded in carrying through to a logical conclusion. It is not uncommon to impute the change from the earlier to the later form of his political theory to the disillusionment which he must have suffered as a consequence of the failure in his attempt to take part in the affairs of Syracuse, and it may well be that this experience brought home to Plato the actualities of political life in an especially poignant fashion. At the same time, it is impossible to suppose that he went to Syracuse with the expectation of founding an ideal state ruled by a philosopher-king, and then modified his views because he failed. Plato himself in the 7th letter says the contrary. In his advice to Dion's followers he says, Let not Sicily nor any city anywhere be subject to human masters, such is my doctrine, but to laws. Subjection is bad both for masters and for subjects, for themselves, for their children's children, and for all their posterity. And though this was written in 353, Plato says also that the plan which he recommends for a legislative commission to draw up new laws is akin to what he and Dion had intended to carry through together. It is clear, therefore, that the venture at Syracuse was from the start designed to issue an estate under the forms of law. The legislative commission, a common device in Greece for formulating a code for a colony, is the literary device which offers the excuse for the laws. And if the Statesman was written about the time of Plato's association with Dion, 367 to 361, the discussion of the relative merits and demerits of law and government evidently marks a doubt in his mind about the feasibility of his conclusions in the Republic. It is safe to conclude, therefore, that Plato never made any sudden change in his convictions, and that he was aware over a long period of years that the omission of law from the idea state was a cardinal difficulty. On the other hand, it is also a fact that Plato never definitely decided that the theory developed in the Republic was erroneous and had to be abandoned. He says repeatedly that his purpose in the laws is to describe a second-best state, and he sometimes puts this assertion into conjunction with his strongest statements about the importance of law. Without laws, men differ not at all from the most savage beasts, and yet if a competent ruler should arise, they would have no need to be ruled by laws, for no law or ordinance is mightier than knowledge. To the end, therefore, Plato was convinced that in a truly ideal state the rule of pure reason, embodied in the philosopher king and unhampered by law or custom, ought to prevail. Perhaps he was never very sure that such an ideal could be realized, but as time went on he became convinced that it could not. The state ruled by law was always a concession to the frailty of human nature, and never something which he was willing to accept as having a right to stand on a parity with the ideal. Still, if the knowledge necessary to make the philosopher king is unattainable, then Plato is clear that the common moral consciousness is right in believing that a government according to law is better than government by men, rulers being what they are. The relation between the two theories is highly unsatisfactory. The ideal is logically irreproachable, but not attainable in fact, while the second-best state not impossible to attain, but is shaky in respect to its credentials. Now the truth is that this difficulty about the best and the second-best state grew directly out of a fundamental problem in Plato's philosophy, which he had to face at many points during the latter part of his life, and which he never succeeded in solving. It was not a question merely of making up his mind whether he did or did not have a high opinion of the law as an element in government. If the line of reasoning followed in the Republic, together with the general body of philosophical principles, was sound, there was no place in the state for law. Conversely, if a place had to be made for law, then there was nothing for it but to modify profoundly the whole philosophical structure, and to admit principles which, to say the least, would greatly complicate it. The situation presented a dilemma, and the fact that Plato himself saw and stated it is the true measure of his intellectual greatness. Probably no critic from Aristotle on has ever stated an objection against Plato which he could not have learned from reading Plato. The exclusion of law from the ideal state resulted from the twofold fact that statesmanship is defined as an art depending upon an exact science, and that this science is conceived, after the manner of mathematics, as a rational apprehension of the type to which factual knowledge contributes nothing, or at least nothing beyond illustration. Behind this theory is the presumption that intelligence and perception are at least disparate and perhaps opposed. Knowledge of the type is impossible so long as a thinker is hemmed in and restricted by all the insignificant variability that the senses show, just as true astronomy is impossible so long as the real motions of the planets are believed to be what they seem to be. On the side of ethics, a knowledge of the good implies alike independence of the inclinations and appetites that are most closely associated with the body. This distinction of body and soul, which occasionally grows into an out-and-out opposition of a lower and higher nature, is a troublesome factor in Plato's thought, though he is never committed to all the implications of once for all accepting it. Now in the field of politics, the positive law, as it actually exists, and is practiced by men in an actual community, must be counted on the side of the senses and the inclinations. This was perhaps more obvious to a Greek than it is now, since Greek law was more completely a matter of use, and wont than is the case where there exists a professional judiciary and the elements of a or less scientific jurisprudence. But in any case, the wisdom of the how is the wisdom of experience, feeling its way from precedent to precedent, making its rules to fit cases as they arise, and never arriving at a very clear-cut knowledge of its principles. In short, it is quite different from what Plato conceived in art to be the self-conscious application of scientifically ascertained causes to produce a clearly foreseen end. The problem was inherent in the contrast of nature and convention from which he started. For if the law belongs to convention, in Greek the words are the same, and cannot be ruled out as a factor in government, how can institutions ever be got on a rational basis where they are sure to realize the maximum natural good? This is no antiquarian problem even today. How is a planned and managed society to make its peace with such enormous psychological forces as those represented by the genius of the Roman law or the English common law? The ordinary business of life, its everyday valuations and expectations, goes on in a matrix of use, and one which changes indeed, but changes slowly, and which has never been planned or even envisaged as a whole, precisely because it is the matrix in which planning and valuation go on. In the mass it is not irrational but non-rational, though parts of it are continually coming to the front as precisely the irrational forces of mere convention or custom which stand in the way of any intelligent modification of the existing order is the customary basis of life, the habitual valuations and ideals by which men regulate their personal ambitions and their dealings with other men to be interpreted as the enemy of intelligence, and the great obstacle in the way of an art of living and governing. In effect, this is the assumption behind the ideal state of the Republic, and that presumption forced Plato to become a rebel against the most cherished political ideal of the state which he desired to save. But if use and wont are not the great enemy, if convention is not the opposite of nature, how can the two be interpreted as supplementing one another? Can a man serve two masters? Or must he not hold to one and despise the other? Plato had learned from Socrates, and he never changed his mind that he must hold to reason, but he became less certain that he must despise convention. And this is the problem of his later political theory, the problem of the place that must be assigned to law in the state. More information, please visit our website www.politicalscienceview.com. Thanks. See again to new topics.